Riki Merrick.
My apologies.
That's okay.
Thank you.
But I'm Riki Merrick. I'm the lead terminologist for the Association of Public Health Laboratories, and I've been working on this particular project around specimen information for a very long time. So, and I was going to tell you about it because I think we're finally getting to it's shareable. So this is about specimen information. So, and I'm not going to use the slideshow because then it's going to go to my other monitor and I'm going to be challenged with moving from slide to slide. So bear with me. So we're going to talk a little bit about the background and what the specimen cross-mapping table is, what we're hoping it can be used for, and what the next steps are. And if you guys have any questions, we can go there. So as you can see, I said, been working on this a long time. In 2009, we had a couple of public health labs and CDC collect all the specimen terms that they had in use and try to harmonize the usage and map to the existing HL7 table terms. So this is back in the version 2 days, no fire in sight yet. And so we're looking at, table 70 for the older versions, or table 487 for the 251, which was pretty new-ish at that point in time. And when we were trying to map these HL7 terms, we noticed that common terms were missing and several terms were ambiguous because they didn't have definitions. They decided when they first put these tables together that the name by itself is definition enough, I guess. And so it was hard to figure out what they meant by some of the terms. So we thought, well, SNOMED is pretty good and provides definitions for things, and we can provide definitions for things, and maybe we should move to SNOMED. And also at the time, we were working closely with Jim Case, who was at the Applied National Animal Health Lab Network back then and had done this already for their work and gave us a starting point. And so that's what we started working off of. And we've been doing this work in what's called the Laboratory and Messaging Community of Practice. And that's the forum for laboratorians to discuss any issues related to vocabulary use and data exchange, improvements of vocab standards, and LIMS setup, and anything else that's around data maintenance in the lab. And this is a community of practice that's chaired by APHL and the CDC. And we've got, depending on the topic and over the years, I mean, this has been in existence for 11 years. So, sometimes we have a large group, sometimes we're a rather intimate, smaller group, but we've had representation from the different public health labs, state and federal, from national reference labs, from terminology service providers, from LIMS vendors and SDOs, especially when we need them, and professional associations. We reach out to them as well as needed. So we're dealing with version 2, as I said, and at least in the US, fire is a long ways away from the lab space, as far as I can tell. So we're still in V2, and we're barely having people actually use 251, which has this wonderful specimen segment. And the specimen segment has a lot of different components. So when you talk about a specimen, you want to know what exactly am I looking at? You want to know, was there something added to it? You want to know how it was collected. You want to know where it was collected from, and potentially you need, more detail about the where. So that's what the source modifier is about. And then potentially you might need to know how you got there. But this is how we've decided, and actually the NOL decided, and we follow suit, is how we're going to code. So we're going to use specimen SNOMED terms from the specimen hierarchy for the specimen type, and then qualifier values for the modifier type and the site modifier, and additives from the substance and product hierarchies, and collection methods from the procedure hierarchy, and source sites from the body site hierarchy. But public health labs deal with dirt and lake water and air and all sorts of other things, so we need to expand it to include substances and physical objects as well. which obviously wasn't necessarily something that the NALM was looking at. So what did we discover back 11 years ago? Most labs have one field to describe the darn specimen, but you know, there's a lot of information that needs to get into that one term. Some labs have a second one for the specimen source, so they'll do something like, I have a swab, and then they say the specimen source was the nasopharynx. And some labs wanted to support all the SPM fields when they were moving to 251, because they said, hey, this is great, because then I can query my data on, you know, all the collection methods that I had for a specific source or whatever. And so that's how we came up with the idea of the specimen cross-mapping table, so that we can have a single term, which most labs support, and we can map that across multiple fields so that the labs that can support all of the SPM fields can still deal with it. So that was the original idea, is to have a local term to a single specimen term for all the historical data, including the HL7 table terms, and then provide a mapping from that single specimen term to all the specimen source term fields in the SPM segment. While we were going through it, we realized, you know, we needed definition for each term, and as part of that, the data quality when you're looking at the data for specimen is pretty bad, because a lot of the times the people that need to put that data in are not super educated about what exactly it is they're dealing with. They're just picking from a list and picking what's, you know, sort of looks right. And so we wanted to include link to collection instructions and basically make it a tool for education at the same time. Also, that data entry field has a lot of job turnover as well. So that was another reason to include that education piece. And then when we were reviewing the terms, we stumbled upon, well, it depends how much you need to know about the specimen term, what type of lab test you're ordering. So for a micro test, it's really important when you look at urine to know how it was collected, because you want to know whether was it collected sterilely or not. But that might not be as important for chemistry. So then we expanded and try to provide guidance on what kind of specimen is good for the different lab areas, and obviously harmonize and standardize the use of terms across the table. And so the goal is really to become a national resource of a curated vocabulary that can be the starting specimen table for EHR and LIS vendors, so that not everybody starts mapping their own. So this is where we started. First use, map the local term to what we call the FLIP preferred name. So FLIP stands for Public Health Laboratory Interoperability Project, and that was the project we were working on back in 2009. And it's still called that, but it's that's historical, right? And so we had, you know, different representations for the same concept, as you're all very well familiar with. And then we took that FLIP preferred name and mapped it across the SPM segment fields. And because most labs only, I mean, every lab has at least one term, we decided to have the rule that for this SPM4 field, even though it's really the what, we were going to use the most pre-coordinated term we could find for that specific term that we're using. So in this case, nasopharyngeal aspirate, you could have made this an aspirate and then structure of nasopharyngeal cavity, but we said, well, we're going to make this, use this pre-coordinated term, but we're also going to include the other defining elements of that term based on this term's definition. So, you know, we looked at SNOMED and said, how is this term defined, and then populated accordingly into our columns. So during that process, obviously we realized there was, you know, some new terms that were needed. Some specimen types weren't in there at all. Some needed to get clarification. Some needed more synonyms. And so we've definitely provided or requested several terms and changes over the course of the 11 years. Mostly to Jim Case when he was at an LM. Then the next use was the provide education. So again, for this flip preferred name, we really wanted to make sure that if somebody picks this up later, they still know what we mean by stool or synovial fluid. And these are obviously easier terms than some of the other ones that people could come up with. And so we try to be really precise in the definition and include our sources. And then we would, we also have, of course, a comment field where, you know, we can make any other comment. And I think since then we may have split the definition column into 2 columns where there's a separate link for the collection manual and collection instructions. And then this is the preference by lab domain. So we have a usage for it for each domain. So for example, the anorectal swab is discouraged from the microdomain because you're going to have a lot of other stuff growing on it. So who knows what you're going to get. But for molecular testing, you know, that may be a preferred term. Similar for urine and micro, just urine as a term is not really good. But you would only use it as a prototype maybe so that you're including the source site and the collection method if you're using urine. And for chemistry, that might be, you know, okay, who knows if you really need to know the collection method, if that's important to chemistry or not. We actually haven't worked with the chemistry folks yet on that. So what are the benefits of the specimen cross-mapping table? The idea is that, you know, it could be a single click data entry for the physician or the person ordering the specimen and describing the specimen when they're submitting it for testing. We can retain the local codes for display so that they're understandable in the local arena, and we have available definitions for education if needed. We obviously have a standardized SNOMED representation, and hopefully if that gets carried, you know, remains in the data going forward, it'll provide the specimen details not only for ordering, but for the subsequent result reporting and reporting for public health, because obviously that was our angle from the public health perspective. And then we're hoping it'd be easy implementation for vendors. So here's what the specimen cross-mapping table implementation might look like. So you have a display term of a BAL of the left lower lung. That's what the data enter clicks. And in the EHR, it's you know, that particular display term is mapped to that flip preferred term, which transforms into these 4 elements. And that's what is on the order for the lab. So we're working on creating governance for this. We've engaged a lot of stakeholders. We've definitely engaged the subject matter expert community. And what we haven't quite done is define a feedback mechanism and a change control and review process. We have done that for other things, but not for this specific table. And the other important thing is define distribution. And this is where I was when I emailed Jane and said, hey, you know, I'm looking for a home for this resource. What could we do? So the next steps are keep reviewing the terms. So we've worked with the microbiology, American Society of Microbiology. They've finished their review. We're working with CAP, and then we need to, you know, get these other folks to review it. Right now it's an access database, which is probably not the easiest way, but that's all I know how to put together. And so we're seeking input on the feasibility of, you know, how easily is it usable in this format for EHR and LIS systems. And it could potentially become the backbone for a, you know, public specimen collection manual that, you know, already houses how do you collect which specimen. So that's all I have.
Okay, thank you, Riki. I should have said at the start of this, actually, as we're running a webinar, the attendees will note that you can't speak. So if you do have questions, you'll see a Q&A at the bottom of the screen. So please type your questions into the Q&A. I don't mind, if someone wants to type very quickly, we can take questions now. Otherwise, the way we usually do this is stack up all the questions and answer them at the end.
It works.
I don't
Either
mind,
way.
I don't mind either way. Right, so thank you, Riki.
My pleasure.
So I think what we'll do is we'll move on to Dr. Wong and I think Jay Kola. I think they're going to do a bit of a double act. I'm assuming anyway. So can I hand over the screen to either one of you or both of you?
Yeah, if you can hand over to you, Wai Keong.
Why don't I talk over the screen first, and then afterwards you can do the same.
Sounds great. Yeah.
Right. Okay. First, thank you, Charles and Ian to reaching out to myself and Jay to give us the opportunity to speak and to share a piece of work that we've been doing over the last few years. I'm just going to share my screen, and let's hope the presenter start view present. Right. It's gone straight. Let me go back to slide 1. So today we'll be telling you about Keytrials, which is a trials discovery platform that we've been creating over the last few years, and how we have kind of brought clinical informatics and terminology into the research world. So I'm Wai Keong. I'm a hematology consultant and the Chief Research Information Officer at UCLH, which is a major teaching hospital and academic center in London. Jay, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Jay Kola. I am perhaps the software geek on this project, but I have had a long history of being involved in SNOMED CT in various roles within the previous committees, and I work in various national release centers.
So how did all this started? It actually started on a ward round that I was doing on my hematology ward with a colleague who runs a lot of phase 1 clinical trials. So phase 1 is kind of first in man type trials in the field of myeloma, which is a relatively rare cancer of the hematological system. And he used to get lots and lots of queries from his colleagues all over London and all over the country saying, do you have something open for my patient? Do you have something open for my patient? So we thought, okay, how can we have a potential technological solution to ease this question? So a typical question is, I've got a young male patient who has a relapsed follicular lymphoma. What's available for them? So why is it important for an organization, like UCLH or perhaps the whole of London, to be able to have a place where people can find trials easily for either themselves or for their patients? One is around equitable access. We need to make things discoverable so that people can look out for opportunities to take part in research. In big organizations like where I work, this tends to be less of a problem, but for a lot of my colleagues who work in hospitals that feed into the major centers, they may not have as easy visibility of what's available. Transparency for organizations like UCLH is important too. A lot of public money gets invested in organizations like us, and we need to be able to demonstrate what we are doing with the public money. And of course, finally, recruitment. It's a lot of effort going to designing trials. We need to kind of match trials to patients. So what about existing websites? So there's a lot of websites out there which provide quite similar, provides this functionality. The typical one that most people will know is clinicaltrials.gov, which is hosted in the US by the NIH, I think, and has trials internationally. And more locally in the UK, there's something that used to be called the NIHR, that's the National Institutes of Health Research Gateway, but is now called Be Part of Research. The trouble is that a lot of the existing websites are not particularly up to date, especially with regards to where a trial is open. And this is largely because sometimes the local trial centers do not inform the center, and there's always a bit of a latent delay. So for trials that only open for like 2 months, by the time it reaches the center, it's already closed. And a lot of these websites also do not contain contact details for local investigators where you want to get in touch with them if you got a possible patient. They don't have notifications. So, I'm interested in trials of follicular lymphoma in a 35-year-old. Can I subscribe to this search so that it lets me know? And the other big thing is that it doesn't integrate with electronic health record systems. So if I have a patient in front of me that on the problem list already has something like lung cancer, can I easily query a platform or a site to let me know if there are potential trials open at my local organization or nearby? And finally, there's also a lot of these sites are obviously hosted by national organizations, and it doesn't provide the capability for, if you as a hospital or just an individual disease group, spin up an instance just for your particular area. And everyone knows the importance of mobile applications nowadays. So to kind of meet these requirements, there were a few kind of principles that we wanted to adhere to. This was fully funded by the Biomedical Research Center at UCLH, so it's taxpayers' money. So we felt that to return to the NHS, it should be open source. That I was really keen to ensure that we bring clinical informatics standards and principles to the design of this. We need to have a mobile application, and it needs to be easy to maintain. What I mean by easy to maintain is that we can't have data managers at the local sites, doing dual entry of when a trial is open into their local R&D system and also on a platform like this. So what I'm going to do now is to do a demo of the live website. So I'm just going to stop sharing and reshare, if that makes sense, so that I choose the right thing. Right, I think this should be it. Okay, so this is the website that is live at the moment at UCLH. The website is called Find the Study, but as you can see at the bottom here, is powered by our platform. So if I just very quickly go into this, so UCLH usually have more trials open than this, but a lot of them has been suspended because of COVID. So the ones that you see here are the ones that are kind of still open. So in the text box here, it's a free text search that can very quickly search through the titles and keywords of all the 265 trials. You could filter on the left-hand side here on the phases and the types of studies. So for example, I can type myeloma, and you can see it searches really quickly. And Jay will go into the technical details on how that all works. And as you can see, you could filter, unfilter, and when you click on it, it gives you a description, it gives you inclusion/exclusion criteria, and it provides you a button where you can click to contact the local R&D office if you are interested in finding out more. So now that is very much free text. So you may ask, what has this to do with clinical informatics principle? So what we were really keen to do is to find a way of tagging all these studies with a SNOMED CT concept and use SNOMED CT to drive the actual search. So this is we call it a beta function, and Jay will explain why. So I'm going to try that now. So here, so I'm going to type lung cancer, for example, and you can see that it has found 8 trials to lung cancer. And in fact, the term lung cancer itself doesn't have to be mentioned at all in any of the description because it's semantically linked. And you can see here, at the moment, I think by default, it's set to only search the children concepts of lung cancer. And if I include the ancestors as well, you can see quickly it's gone from 8 to 19 because you could see that trials such as this, where it's just about any pediatric cancers, which may be lung or otherwise, is also included. So it gives you, so the semantic search gives you that kind of really powerful capability. I'm just going to stop this share again and show you a little bit of how it kind of works in the background. Hang on. I'm just going to share my screen, it's probably easier. Okay, so stop presenting this and show you, yeah. So you can see what's happening. Let me do a semantic search again. So what you can see here in the background is that these SNOMED CT concepts have been tagged against that particular study. So searching lung cancer will find non-small cell lung cancer. And if I did a toggle to include ancestors, you could see, like, this is an interesting one where someone is doing a study on COVID and oncology, and it's just got tagged as malignant neoplastic disease. And obviously lung cancer is a type of neoplastic disease, and it actually found that trial as well. Here you could see some additional functionality. You could save this search so that you can get notifications of it. And these are some other admin functions which you won't see if you, in kind of a usual login. So I think that's what I'm going to stop the live demonstration and go back to the actual presentation. You present. So this is how a notification looks like. Right, so the next thing is about EHR integration. So once we have our trials tagged to a SNOMED CT concept, you can start seeing how you could start having bridges between an electronic health record system and the platform. So what you see here is a screenshot of Epic. So UCLH uses Epic. For our US colleagues, you'll be very familiar with this EHR. And on the problem list, you could see lung cancer with an associated ICD-10 code. So using the ICD, so we use this, Jay will go into more detail, but we use a standard called info button. So what happens is that if you right-click search active guidelines on lung cancer, it will actually pass through into Keytrials the age of the patient and the ICD-10 code. And the ICD-10 code will be mapped to SNOMED, and as you can see, it will pull back these things. So for example, if you look at this trial at the bottom here, there's no mention of lung cancer anywhere in the title. It used the abbreviation of non-small cell lung cancer, and it actually did manage to detect that particular study. Just a note there about the age, and Jay will let you know how that works. So it is at this point that I'm going to stop sharing and pass over this presentation to Jay to tell you about how it all works in the background.
Cool. If you bear with me, I'm just going to share my screen, and I might actually do PowerPoint. Let's see if that works. If it all goes horribly wrong, then I'll switch back to Google Slides. Can you see my screen now?
Yes,
yep.
Screen.
Perfect. Okay, so let me present from here. All right. So I always love Wai Keong telling the story because he tells it from the user's perspective, saying here's what matters, here's what we want to do. And in many ways, I think all I had to do in this project, or actually the team had to do, is to say, how do we take all our SNOMED knowledge and make all those things work? Because the clinicians really don't care. They just want to make it more intuitive and useful for them. So what Wai Keong showed you, for some people might look like, well, there seems like lots of things going on, seems impressive, but how much of it is real? So the first thing I'll say is to be able to right-click on a patient who sat in front of you and to say, tell me what trials this patient is eligible for, I think is what this whole thing is really about, right? And the really cool thing is, and Wai Keong is here, it took him 20 minutes to actually configure Epic to talk to Keytrials, because we had based everything on standards. All right, so let's actually then tell you how we actually did it. Sorry to present a dummies version. It's not because I'm treating you as dummies, but because we had to cover too much ground. Okay, so simple story. We will have local trials, as you can imagine. Sticking a user interface on top of it, I would say easy peasy, any software developer should be able to do it. Otherwise, they shouldn't call themselves software developers. Boom, okay. That's the easy part. Now we've got EHR systems, great. Getting them to link and talk to these clinical trials is the hard part. Why is it hard? Because they exist in two different states. Local trials are, trials actually are mostly based on text. They have lots of things that need to be parsed and converted into actual criteria, because the criteria is what determines what that trial is about. Of course, we know EHR systems actually have coded bits, or at least some of the demographic bits that are actually structured. So we're now going from an unstructured world to a structured world, and we want to build a bridge. And that's where I think all of this plays out. So obviously, as you can imagine, unstructured to structured, you would have to depend on annotation or natural language processing. So 3 steps. Again, first thing we do, we take all the existing trials, stick them into a platform. Second, we take all these trials and we annotate them so we can actually convert them to SNOMED, like think. And the third is then we say, right, now that we've got all these trials that have now been mapped, how can we connect them to data that's actually SNOMED or actually coded in the EHR? As simple as that. Of course, as you can imagine, for us, at this point, it was mostly the diagnoses, the age, and the gender that was important. So first thing, platform. Easy peasy, that's the Keytrials platform, open source, anybody can go download it, test it, break it, tell us it doesn't work, right? Second, obviously it's built on enterprise technologies, so the same technology that Amazon uses, Microsoft use. We used all that, which is why you can see that blazingly fast performance. Yes, there were 200 trials, but previously it used to be close to 2,000 trials. It makes no difference to it. The tech still works just the same. Okay. Second, the integrations are actually what is really important, and that's where the platform plays. There are 3 integrations. First, with the EHR, as we can imagine. Second, with the users to show them the information that is being pulled out. And third, with the trials, local trials registry. And every single point, our principle was adopt as standard, don't write custom integrations, okay? So Keytrials platform, we have the local trials within UCLH. They actually sit and use the system called Edge, no problem. We had to integrate that into the platform, which is what we did. We then had to integrate the platform back into the EHR. And to do this, we used HL Send Info button. Now you might ask, what was going on in the integration between the R&D platform to Keytrials? Well, we couldn't actually use an existing standard, and we'll go into details why. Then, where we wanted to annotate things, we said, cool, SNOMED CT it is, and we'll use a terminology server to actually power all these searches and all these functionality. Okay, just for the geeky people, if you're geeky enough, it has got RESTful APIs, which means writing things like mobile apps is absolutely trivial. Okay, first thing, local trials registry. How do we import? Well, we had to do batch processing. We had to write our own code. Bad news is not really reusable. Good news, I guess, at least in the UK, we know it's the same system is actually used by, I think, 60%, I'm told, of the rest of the hospitals. So hopefully now that we've done the work, anybody who's got that system can actually plug in and actually get it to import data into Keytrials. Okay, won't go into details, but we'll come back to it. Second part, how did we make the trials data coded, which is where unstructured to structured comes in. But then we first tried to make the choice, what coding system do we use? We said, well, broadly, ICD-10, SNOMED CT, and yes, I've got a side bias against mesh because I know I hear this word. I'm hoping people here on this call are not going to consider it. I won't go into details why, but yeah. So we chose SNOMED because of 2 important reasons. We wanted intuitive search, like the way Wai Keong was showing you, and of course the breadth of coverage, because we knew trials or clinical studies would cover not just diagnoses, but tomorrow there would be interventions, surgeries, or radiation, and other things that are going in there. And we knew SNOMED would give us all that coverage. Okay, simple. This is what Wai Keong was showing you, so I won't go into all the details. As you can imagine, it actually then relies on SNOMED hierarchies to go into given the concept, what are all the children or the descendants of it actually, and what are all the ancestors. So spelling agnostic or word agnostic search, how does it work? So imagine the Keytrials search API, when a user picks something, it actually sends that condition back to the terminology server. The terminology server says, okay, given this condition, give me all the descendants of it, right? So in this case, it's actually sending for T-cell lymphoma, and you can see all the things that are actually coming back. This result is actually sent back again to the search API. That API then uses those codes, so SNOMED CT concepts, to actually say, now give me all the trials that are actually tagged or annotated with this concept. And then boom, they get shown to the user. By the way, all of that was happening on the fly, under a second. So it all works, no problem. Again, because I wasn't sure about Wai Keong was going to show you something or not, so I thought, let me actually just add a screenshot. So as you can see here in this case, I was just randomly, and I like to break the system, by the way, I just went and said, viral disease, what's it going to get? And boom, it does actually get me COVID, which is cool. So we know that part of the hierarchical search works, great. What is the next bit? The next bit for us to do is to then say, can we actually, how do we convert all this into SNOMED coded or structured data in some ways? We call it annotated because structured really implies something else, at least in the EHR world, so we call them annotated. And to enable the broader coverage, we chose to do this. Okay, so that for us is the, remember the other strength of SNOMED. What did we do to enable it? Well, once we had imported all the data or the trials into the backend, we have an annotation API, which means for every given trial, it can actually shove up that trial back into the NLP engine, which in this case is a quite popular open source engine called BioOD, which is built by Sheffield University. I think there's only a few, there's a few well-recognized NLP engines, and this happens to be one of them. What it does is it actually returns ICD-10 codes. Don't ask me why. Okay, what we then do is we use that terminology server to say, right, now that it's returned these ICD-10 codes, what would these actually be in SNOMED? And we then go back and add those SNOMED concepts. In fact, when it returns those matches in SNOMED, the concepts for that trial, for annotations, we present them to the user, because what Wai Keong did not show you, and if, we're going through this very manually, if we were doing it manually, the user would get a choice to say, is this the right SNOMED annotation that's being generated or not? Cool. Imagine all that has happened. Now we get to the real part, which is, okay, I've got trials, I've got annotated trials. How do I now join them up with my EHR data? So to do this, we went down the info button route. So I don't know how many people actually on the call know. Usually when I'm standing in the room, I'll say how many people know it, and I'll say, raise your hand, and I can't do that. So I'll just assume you don't know, maybe. So I'll just give you a short introduction of what this is. It's a standard by HL7 that allows people to access knowledge bases. So for example, if it's a documentation that is out there, guidelines that is out there, people can actually write these predictable queries against it and retrieve information to be displayed back to the user. What we did, we said, this looks like a cool standard to access a knowledge base. So we now turned our annotated trials into a knowledge base of sorts, so that we could use the standard to actually access or query the data that's already been annotated. So what would that look like? That would look like a HTTP request for people who are geeky enough to understand it. That's what it would look like. So that URL actually has got 2 query parameters, and it's got 2 query parameter values. Okay. Again, not going into details, but that's broadly what is built. The standard itself has got a whole lot of URL parameters. I'm only highlighting the really important ones. So the main search criteria is a really key one here, because it's the place where you can add a coded concept, right? And that's where ICD or SNOMED or something else comes in. Gender, age are relevant for us. So yeah, cool. So if we now try to build a URL query based on info button standard, that's kind of what it would look like. Okay, and that one has got 2 criteria: age, which is that bit, and it's got the search criteria, the coded diagnosis, which is that bit. That actually translates into, give me all trials that actually have a patient with the age of 78 and an IC diagnosis of lung cancer, kind of what Wai Keong was showing you. Okay, so behind the scenes, when somebody in Epic clicks a button, the button that Wai Keong was showing you, that's what gets generated as a standard text, as a standard query, gets sent off to the info button API, which is a functionality in the platform, Keytrials platform, and essentially it says, cool, here's all your actual matching results, which automatically get opened by Epic in a new tab because Wai Keong spent that 20 minutes to configure it, and that's all it took. So having said all that, what did we learn? Well, first thing we learned is data. Handling clinical trials data is really hard because there are actually really no really coolly adopted standards. They have different scopes. CDISC, ODM is good, but doesn't really reflect all the things that people would want. It's more of a recruitment data, whereas people, the clinicians themselves, care about something else. Now, FHIR has got a research study standard resource. It's not quite really mature enough. And this is just based on our experience probably from a year ago. We did play with it. Again, the implementation, the results of those experiments, you can see in that link below. So we found importing data was painful. What would that mean? So why should we actually have to do this importing every time? I won't go into that details, but we then learned quite a lot about NLP itself. What we learned is, in fact, some of the engines that are out there actually really rely on UMLS or ICD. I would love to see these things work natively in SNOMED, and we actually found some issues with BioYodi itself when we started to use it with SNOMED with some of the accuracy, and we started to actually work with the developers of BioYodi as part of a different project that didn't go forward, but that's by the by. But what we think is there's a lot of value in more and more native integration of SNOMED into those NLP engines, which would be really cool for projects like ours. Third part, and I'm not trying to actually inflame anything, I'm just saying, now we know that there's a lot of world out there that actually says we are on ICD-10, okay? For the record, UCELH Epic instance, as you were saying, it does have ICD-10, but it also contains SNOMED codes. You just have to do a couple of multiple jumps or at least one jump to get to the SNOMED code. It's also stored. I'm just saying, what we found is the world is not fully ready yet, although we built it. Now, what we did and we had to do is we had to go through this indirection of first going to ICD and from ICD going to SNOMED. And anybody who understands and knows SNOMED will turn around and say, Jay, that sounds like an idiotic thing to do. You're actually going from something that's less granular to something more granular. Surely you're going to have semantic loss, right? Which is absolutely true. But in this context, remember, what we want is to expand the scope of the trials that actually match. So it actually works out, no problem. Okay. Whereas if you're trying to be really precise, then that would be a problem. So in this case, I'm not saying it's perfect. It works for our use case. And at this point, I generally stop talking and basically say, what on earth does all of this mean? Well, actually, going back to what Wai Keong was saying, it's about improving visibility of clinical trials. It's actually getting more people to look at trials. And I'm told back in the day, the previous system used to get barely like 1 hit or 2 hits a couple of months. And I don't want to misrepresent anybody, but that's my recollection of some meetings. And I know now when we look at the Keytrials platform, there's hundreds of people logging in every month. There's lots and lots of views on it. So I will leave Wai Keong to explain what that actually means. Now, the really important thing I think that we demonstrated here is we can use existing standards to support that integration between trials and EHR systems, which means anybody who has actually got who's got a info button compliant EHR system, for example, Cerner could be able to actually download a copy of Keytrials and suck in all the data into it, right? If they're using Edge, it's trivial, suck in data, hit the annotation button, and then boom, they should be able to actually integrate this thing into their system. Okay, so now I think it's probably just a good time to pass back to Wai Keong because this is all about, so what next?
Thanks, Jay, for that. I hope you don't mind being my slight advancer. So as I said, it is open source. So for those who want to, you could download the platform locally and see how you get on with it. Most recently in COVID, there was a particular use case that the Shelford group of 10 hospitals were really keen to have a platform to show what studies were open in those 10 sites. So we got in touch with Jay, who they spun up a different instance, a COVID-19 instance of Shelford. Yep. So that's it. Yeah, different colors, the Shelford colors compared to UCLH colors. So that was interesting because we had to do integration to another backend, which we can go into more detail if needed. But it was all done in I think in a week. I think, Jay. So now, as Jay said as well, NLP has never really been used on clinical trial descriptions or inclusion and exclusion criteria. So that can be an area of active research that we'd like to go into. And as Jay talks about the research study resource in FIRE. Do you want to go next and next, I think?
Cool, here we go.
So for those who are interested in collaborating in developing the platform, we are really keen to welcome you in, and I think everything else we've already mentioned there. The final point about patients is an interesting one because when we show this to a lot of people, and for example locally at UCLH to the lead of our patient involvement engagement group, the first thing you say is, how can we make this resource more patient friendly? And actually, I think that's much less about the technology, but much more about the editorial aspects on making trial descriptions and things accessible to non-healthcare professionals. So that is an area that we like to go into, and we're keen if there are any partners who want to do that. Next, Jay. So a little bit about the commercials. So UCLH BRC owns the IP, even though it's open source for the platform. Jay's company provides the service wrapper for the Find the Study website, and have done most of the development, if not all development so far. You can go next. Yeah, so just to I think we can skip this. I think we've talked about this already. And yes, and because this is a platform, developing an application should be relatively straightforward, and there's one already in a very late stage of development. And I think Jay, I think that might be the end. Yes. So that's the end.
What it doesn't have is a link to the open source project, but hey, you guys can go on, you can ping us, you can download and test all this. And of course, please go and break those systems. Please don't try to break Wai Keong's live system. If you want, there's a UAT system also we can give you access to. Questions?
So Jay, trust me, I guarantee I can break it if you give me time. Give me a chance. You never know. Thank you. So first of all, thank you to both presenters. I think it's interesting that both subject matters, so the focus of previous webinars and the focus of future webinars is more around the clinical utility of SNOMED. So rather than developing SNOMED for SNOMED's sake, looking at a real live clinical problem, if you like. And then looking at how SNOMED can support a solution. And I think in both cases, that is true. Two very important clinical areas. So, Riki, the whole kind of public health laboratory, very important in terms of disease management at a population level, but also just in terms of sheer quantity of data. Clinical trials, so with Dr. Wong and Jay, definitely a big area, which is becoming more important as we move forward, particularly in the genomics space. So I suppose I'll mirror one of the questions which Riki's already answered via the Q&A thing, the Q&A functionality, but you're obviously, so Riki, you're obviously based in the US, but is there an international perspective to the work around the specimen table and mappings?
No, not explicitly. So one of the issues, of course, is, SNOMED being, member country specific. So in the US, obviously we're members, so it's a little easier to deal with access and the like, especially since the cross-mapping table does retain the relationships between the concepts by nature of, the definition of the fields that we put them in. But indirectly, there is, of course, some international aspect just by the sole thing that we have EHR vendors and LIS vendors that obviously have products that they are selling internationally, participating in the community of practice. So we have a little bit of it, but it's mainly US focused. And I think, the distribution, I mean, as you saw on the slide, I'd said, the goal was to be a national resource. I mean, hey, if it could be international, that'd be even better. But then we get into, who's allowed to use it and all of that, and how do we deal with that? But again, that was my original, quest to SNOMED International, is how can we, distribute this and make it available to folks once we're finished with it, which I'm hoping after 11 years we get done sooner or later.
So, well, it's a labor of love, obviously. So you'll be doing it.
Well, it is a volunteer driven effort. So there are no paid positions working on it, which is why it's taken 11 years, because, it gets dug up whenever it gets a little bit lighter. And right now is not a good time to find light work unless somebody has a time turner or something like that, which if you do, please share.
Okay, and I have a question for, well, probably Wai and Jay, actually, to both of you. So have you, just out of curiosity, have you looked at doing some kind of, I don't know, audit quality measurements of the change in practice using the new system?
That's a good question. I have to say we've not entered, if you like, the evaluation phase of it. So it went live in kind of July and August last year. There's also some context that at UCLH we are only gone live with Epic in the last year or so. So I'm quite involved in that program. So, and of course, as everyone is aware, in the last 2 months and 3 months, a particular viral disease have taken over all our lives. So that will be very interesting to see actually how to evaluate the use besides, but unfortunately, no, not at the time being yet.
Okay, hang on. I'm just letting Charles know. You can unmute yourself, Charles.
Yeah, I think I'm good. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So I have a question back to Riki, actually, following on that one about internationalism and so on. So that Riki, thank you for answering it in the chat bar, and then a second time to Ian. But I wanted to just test whether, given the syndromic surveillance sort of networks that you have in the US, do you know if your cross-mapping table is actually used by public health labs, for example, for tracking COVID infection and so on, and the particular, that increasingly, I think what we've seen in the UK is that all sorts of samples become COVID positive, including the anorectal swab that you were so down about earlier. But are you able to describe if that's used in your public health laboratories?
So obviously this cross-mapping table has been around, and there are a couple of public health labs that have actually implemented whatever version it was out when they implemented it. I don't know how well they keep up, but I use it all the time when I have to. So I'm the lead terminologist for the Association of Public Health Laboratories, and we provide technical assistance to whoever's asking that's in that space around lab data that needs help reporting to public health in a formatted version. Yeah. And so I use it all the time to look up specimen terms that, especially come up for COVID testing. So one of the other projects I work on is the LIVD file for COVID, where we look at the different test kits that have been FDA approved for test use in the United States. and we provide, the required coding for reporting that electronically in an HL7 message. So for those specimen types that are listed in those package inserts, I use it for lookup all the time.
Yeah, yeah. And then sort of to move a bit
people who are using it, I mean, I'm seeing, I'm also seeing some of the data that are being reported, obviously, as part of my work, and not the public health labs are actually pretty good compared to some of the other labs that I see data from, mainly because the public health labs have had this FLIP project for a long time, which is for reporting influenza results to the CDC. Yeah. And for that, we have pretty tightly controlled vocabulary every time a new test is added. Normally, we have a change control board meeting, and we say, hey, yeah, okay, well, we'll add it, and these are the codes we're going to use to report this, and everybody's using the same thing. Obviously, that went a little bit by the wayside with this virus that's going around, but we are still, trying to provide support, and so we are looking at, we're validating their test messages, and we are looking at specimen type coding. So on the specimen type coding, and the public health labs, I think, are actually ahead, which is a rarity.
Yeah, but you may save a lot more lives. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. Can I turn then a question towards Jay and Wai Keong, which Wai will know what I'm going to get onto, but I'm still a bit puzzled that you've chosen as your substrate in EPIC ICD-10 rather than the SNOMED CT that lies somewhere under the hood in EPIC. Because obviously we have the same kind of challenge in Cerner, although I don't think we would elect to use ICD-10, partly because you've got to use your inpatient coded data. So if your patients are not yet inpatients, you won't have that, at least not at Barts Health, and I suspect even at UCLH, glorious as you are, you're not doing ICD-10 coding unless you admitted a patient. So I don't quite understand why you've used ICD-10, because you will lose some patients, it seems to me, and two, somewhere in EPIC you've got the whole of SNOMED to suck into your system. So I just don't quite get it.
It's actually quite an easy one to answer, Charles. The reason that we don't use SNOMED is because the implementation of HL7 info button in EPIC only exposes ICD-10 at the moment.
Okay.
So that's one. And honestly, I have not approached their developers to see if they could make a change that I don't have to pay too much money for to ensure they support SNOMED. So that's one. The second point, Charles, around coded. So even on our problem list, which is added by clinicians, every single term is actually mapped to ICD-10. So there are lots of areas in our organization that has quite a good uptake of problem list usage. In fact, our pre-assessment nurses for surgery has really taken it on. So interestingly, a lot of our surgical patients have very comprehensive problem lists and comorbidities. So that's how we overcome it. So you don't have to wait for the coders. If you like, to do that. So they're using an interface terminology that then maps to ICD-10. Is that what you're saying? That's correct. So we have a commercially available interface terminology vendor that I think 98% of all EPIC installations use, at least in the English-speaking world, internationally.
So funnily enough, I think the Cerner deployment and implementations in the UK, the info button is driven by SNOMED CT.
It'll be great, actually, to have a Cerner site to want to try to do a bit of Keytrials integration. It will be a lot simpler in a sense. You don't have to go through the ICD-10 route.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, how interesting. We'll have to talk some more.
So Jay, I believe you have a question for Riki.
I did. I wasn't quite sure if we've got time.
We've always got time.
Right. So, Riki, so in some ways, I guess, when I'm not doing this weird stuff in Keytrials that I also do, I also am involved in the National Pathology Standards work for England. So we've been doing similar things to what you've been describing. And also interestingly, what we've published for just for enabling COVID standardization is also a list of specimens, a list of findings, a list of codes, and they also look like your cross map because here's what might be familiar to you, but here's what this would look like in SNOMED, and here's what this would look like to somebody in the lab, right? So it does take that cross map approach to doing it. In some ways, I wasn't quite sure. You mentioned an access database. You said you are here with SNOMED International because you would like to share this. What would be the best way to, your preferred way to take this forward, without just putting you in touch with the UK people? And in some ways, I guess it's also a question for the people on here as well to say, is there some way where we can actually put all this information, say, here's what we've got, can we start to look at it?
Yeah, I was just answering your email. We don't have it publicly available, obviously, for quite yet. We're working with it. Actually, when we're reviewing it in an Excel file, which I can happily mail around, but that's obviously not the, you're probably more interested in how the database is organized in the background. I don't have the latest version that I can share right now, but I can get it to you and email it to you. But yeah, I mean, if there is any different way, when I was talking, to the folks, some of the folks that are on this call earlier about how to distribute it, we were talking about, finding a different way of presenting that data so that it's easier accessible, maybe with API calls and stuff. And, how would you put that in FHIR and what resource would you use? So we had some discussions around that, but we didn't quite finish that. And obviously we haven't migrated anything over to anything.
So I guess the pretty straightforward dumbest question is, which other group in SNOMED have you been talking to? Because if that's where we should go, start to take this, then that's happy to take it there. Because what I don't want is all of this being lost in emails, because things do get lost in emails.
Right. I talked, it was Jane and Ian and Jim Case, and I'm sure I'm forgetting, like there were 2 more people and I'm forgetting their names, and I apologize for not coming up with them right away. But yeah, so there's the, the SNOMED on FHIR group. Yep. that meets on Tuesday afternoons, I believe it is, that we could certainly maybe try to corrupt some time and work on that.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you.
So I think I'll do a bit of a follow on from that. So the other 2 people are Susie Roy and Monica Harry, Riki. Just so you know.
Oh yeah, thanks. Sorry, I totally.
Okay, don't worry.
Totally forgot. Yeah.
So Jay, Jay and Riki actually. So 2 things to bear in mind with a development like this. So one, Riki is correct in what she said earlier, in the fact that the table itself exposes some of the relationships within SNOMED, which normally speaking is a bit of a no-no, right? So we don't allow you to do that if you're an unlicensed user, is the first point. However, when we've come across things like this before, there are a number of avenues that we can pursue which would support making that available to a wider audience, not necessarily a global audience. So one thing to bear in mind is that, yes, any SNOMED member country can access everything that's in Riki's table, of which there are 39 countries now. Some have the US is obvious, but your next door neighbour, so Canada, the UK, there are 20 odd European countries, as well as the likes of Australia, India, New Zealand, etc. So don't let the license be a barrier in some ways. The other thing to say is that sometimes with things like this, we get around it, or we get around the issue of licensing by putting a license statement in whatever the product is. Some of that requires discussion with us. We look at the drivers and everything else. To give you, I suppose, one of the biggest examples I can give you of that, I'm assuming most people on the call will be aware of the Odyssey group, which are a global group running queries against clinical data locally and then sharing the query results. If you look at the terminology that runs on, so if you go into the Athena browser, for example, the Atlas browser, the Odyssey group publish, all of those include the whole of SNOMED. So in terms of concepts, descriptions, and relationships. You can't download their database, but what you can do is access it to define queries. So things like that, if things are visible, even if the relationships are there, it's not a problem. It's more about the access, which is where you stumble across the licensing issue occasionally. But there are ways around it, certainly. I mean, the conversations that we've had with Riki, so from your perspective, I suppose, Jay, so one is looking internally at what's involved. So one is the SNOMED on Fire group, which is more in terms of the forward development, if you like, and upscaling the usability of the table that Riki does. The other conversation was more about, as Riki said, a lot of this at the moment is done free and gratis. So it's done as a hobby, for the want of a better word, by a number of individuals to get this going. And it's been a labor of love for a long time. The other thing is looking at who hosts it. So who has the commitment to continue to publish it, to continue to update it. But Riki's in conversation with us and will continue to be. And we'll explore, but there are always ways around it. So don't let licensing be the be all and end all. That's more about a discussion. The other, I suppose, the other thing to say really is to Wai and Jay. So I have multiple roles in SNOMED. I'm customer relations lead for Europe, and I head up clinical engagement, which is how I get the pleasure of chairing clinical webinars. But the other kind of key interest of mine, and one of the areas that I lead on, is genomics. Now, SNOMED is a member of the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, so GA4GH. There has been, within GA4GH, although I'm not part of the individual work groups that are doing it, quite a lot of discussion on clinical trials. And I can give you contact details for them. I would suggest that it might be in your interest to kind of publicize what you're doing to a wider, potentially global audience in the genomic space, which I think would be useful for you, but also useful for the community looking at how potential solutions can work in this space.
Sounds pretty great.
Just a suggestion. It's entirely up to you whether you pursue it or not. But I'll sort out the details. I'll email both of you the contact details for that.
Perfect. Yeah.
Thanks.
So do we have any other questions for either presenter this evening, or this morning, or this afternoon, depending on where you are? Okay. Well, just before we finish, I have something I'd like to share with you, which has nothing to do with either of the presenters. but I'll do it anyway. So, some of you will be aware, who've been involved in SNOMED for a time, that we normally have in October a business meeting and expo meeting, which travels the world. So we tend to move it between regions each year. This year was scheduled to be in Portugal, in Lisbon, but due to COVID, we've decided to go virtual. So on our website, you'll see on snomed.org, you'll see links to which tells you about the expo and also the business meetings. There's a full, the full agenda for both meetings. But the thing that I'd like to point you to is that on the Wednesday, so on the 7th of October, we're going to have a meeting, well, not a meeting, a number of meetings even, dedicated to clinical. And if I can just get this thing to move on. Where's the, here we go. So on the Wednesday, we're going to run some clinical sessions. So we're going to run a 2-hour session looking at an overview of what we've been doing in the clinical engagement space from SNOMED's perspective, and also from within the community. So looking at really a good umbrella overview, if you like, of what's going on in the clinical space related to SNOMED. As that lasts for 2 hours, we'll give you a bit of a comfort break. Then each of the clinical reference groups that we have, so the specific groups focused on particular specialty areas, each are going to meet for an hour and a half in parallel. So you can log on to each one when we've set up the Zoom URLs. So you can go to which ones you want. And then at the end, we'll have a quick half an hour session, pulling it all together and looking at feeding back from each of those groups of what's gone on. From a clinician perspective, I'd like to suggest that you join. We've done a number of clinical sessions at various meetings in the past where we focused for a full day. Going virtual, I don't know about you, but the thought of sitting behind a computer or facing a computer solidly for a day seems a little excessive. But I think we can manage it for the afternoon if we give you a comfort break in the middle. I haven't, the following slide I haven't filled in yet simply because I can't. But what we will do, obviously coming close to the time, is put in all the timings, which clinical reference groups are meeting, and also the Zoom links to enable people to join. So please keep a lookout on our website for that. Go and have a look about the business meeting and the expo. In general terms, all the details are already on there. And if there are no other questions, I personally would like to thank all 3 presenters actually for this evening. I found it very interesting, particularly because I've been involved in both clinical areas in the past, in one form or another. So I've found it very interesting. I'm sure the attendees feel likewise. So I'd like to thank all 3 of you. I'll be posting, so Wai and Jay, I'm going to ask you to send me your slides. When you do, I'll post them on our conference site. Please go on there, and they'll stay on there, and there are also individual conference pages for the previous webinars. Next month's webinar, let me just have a look because I can't remember. The next month's webinar will be on the 5th, so on the 5th of August. And we'll be posting details of presenters and a single Zoom link this time, so we don't lose people going to different sites at the start. So I'll try and reduce the confusion for August meeting. But thank you all. It's been excellent. And with that, I'll bring the meeting to a close. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.
Bye-bye now.